last digital editions live workshop, which is a special one because in a way it ends where it all started, namely at the Reformation pamphlets of the Taylorian. But we are very grateful that we are joined by an international host of specialists to celebrate 500 years of the Passional Christi und Antichristi and its Latin parallel, the Antithesis figurata. So we are joining libraries across the Atlantic with a Pitt's Theology library providing their very interesting annotated copy on which Ulrich Bubenheimer has worked, who is I think the only person definitely in this meeting, but possibly in the world, who has seen all 5 copies that will, in the flesh, that will figure today. So how we are running it today will be that we'll start with an introduction by Edmund Wareham, who has worked since 2016 on the Passional. Then we'll look at the Taylorian copy from which this whole engagement started. Then we'll have an engaged reader, Ulrich Bubenheimer, talking about what other readers made of the Passional. Then we'll have a look at 3 different copies of the book in the Bodleian library, and then look at the crowning glory, the annotated Pitt's Theology library copy. And then it's over to you. I'll stop recording and we are expecting your question and answers. So first of all, over to Ed Wareham.
Thank you very much, Henrike. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So this project's origins go back to 2016, when I taught, together with Lyndall Roper, a history faculty 3rd year special subject on Martin Luther and the German Reformation. As with so many lecturers and teachers who cover the Reformation, we were able to introduce our students to the Passional of Christ and Antichrist, and had the good fortune to take them to the Taylorian library to see the copy of the pamphlet which is held there. It's always a wonderful moment to observe students' reactions to seeing an original 16th century pamphlet before their eyes for the first time. The students were able to play spot the difference between the images, but my sense was that by not being able to understand the text printed underneath each woodcut, they were missing something in their interpretation of the pamphlet. It was at that stage that Henrike and I decided that the Passional would make an excellent addition to the new established Treasures of the Taylorian Reformation pamphlet series. We were then immensely fortunate to benefit from the expertise and generosity of Ulrich Bubenheimer, who came to Oxford in 2018 to look at various pamphlets in Oxford libraries, including all its copies of the Passional. Ulrich then spent time at the Pitt's Theology Library, the University of Emory, as a Richard Kessler Research Fellow, and I subsequently followed in his footsteps and have been fortunate to work with its extraordinary collection of Reformation pamphlets. It's wonderful today to bring everyone together from across the Atlantic and the English Channel, and also to reunite the only 2 known surviving copies of the 3rd edition of the Passional, printed by Matthias Mahler in Erfurt in 1521. What were or are our aims behind a new translation and edition of the Passional? First, as you'll see of the front cover of the physical copy of the publication, which will be released shortly, this is not just an edition of the Passional, but also of the Latin Antithesis, figurata, or vitae Christi et papae. In general, harking back to Gustave Cavro's critical edition of the Passional, which appeared in the late 19th century, the Latin text has been regarded of secondary importance or even ignored altogether. We therefore thought it important to produce a critical edition for the first time and to offer an independent translation of the Latin text. As Ulrich Bubenheimer demonstrates in his introductory essay in the publication, evidence points to the fact that the Latin text was written first, but only published after the appearance of the Wittenberg German language editions. In producing the edition, we uncovered that there are in fact two print variants of the Latin edition, A and B. The Bodleian copy, which we will see later today, is an example of the print variant A, containing errors which were subsequently corrected. A further aim of our publication was to compare systematically the Latin and German versions and see how the translation process, or perhaps more accurately, the adaptation process, was undertaken. Many of the changes were determined by the technological challenges of printing and the simple fact that the German typeface was larger, meaning that the text of the German had to be edited down. Next slide, please, Henrike. Secondly, as you may have noticed, I've at this stage only been talking about texts and not the woodcuts for which the Passional is rightly famous. And a further aim of our publication has been to place greater attention on the textual elements of the pamphlet. In his wonderfully rich essay, which first appeared in 1981 and did so much to introduce the pamphlet to English-speaking audiences, Bob Scribner described the Passional as, I quote, the most successful work of visual propaganda produced by the Reformation. Especially within the English language literature, the Passional has been interpreted art historically, but we felt there was more room to explore how exactly text and image related. On the title page of the Antithesis, for example, which you see before you now, a poem explains that you should read this volume if you want to be learned and pious. The choice of the word read was surely significant. Next slide, please, Henrike. Thirdly, and building on these points, we felt that scholarship tended to focus simply on the Wittenberg edition of the Passional and not explore the transmission history of the pamphlet as a whole. Alongside the Latin version, the pamphlet and its subsequent editions was constantly evolving, and this is most clearly illustrated by the two Strasbourg editions, which appeared later on in 1521, one copy of which is held in the Bodleian, and we'll see later. Extra pairs of contrasts, an elaborate title page, an expanded postscript, and verse couplets in both German and Latin accompanying each image were all added to the pamphlet to heighten its message. In our publication, I translate all this additional textual material into English for the first time to help give access to English-speaking audiences to this important part of the transmission history. Finally, we've designed the publication in such a way as to appeal, we hope, to different audiences. On the one hand, we hope it can be used in the classroom and lecture theatre by pupils and students, especially those who don't have German or Latin. As Scribner remarked, this is an extremely complex work, and that complexity extended to the translation process. The text in general is extremely sparse and contains references to canon law, which are not easily translated directly and require a lot of explanation. We hope that the commentaries which accompany each set of images can assist readers. At the same time, we hope that the publication will also appeal to a more scholarly audience, not least by merging the very latest literature on the pamphlet in both German and English. And this has been one benefit of Ulrich as a German scholar and myself as in England working together, and that's really been an interesting way of bringing together the two literatures on the subject. We hope that through our focus on the different versions of the pamphlet, we can spark renewed interest in the reception history and trace its influence. On 26th of May 1521, Martin Luther, held up in the Wartburg Castle after his interdict at the Diet of Worms, held a copy of the pamphlet in his hands and declared, I quote, "The antithetical Passional pleases me greatly." 500 years after its publication, and for quite different reasons to Luther, it also pleases me greatly today to be able to share our collaborative work with you, on the pamphlet. Thank you for listening, and now there's an opportunity for Emma Huber to show us the Erfurt copy of the Passional held in the Taylorian institution.
Thanks a lot, Ed. That was a really good survey. And I've been trying to edit the Passional for the Taylorian print edition, and I can appreciate the challenges that Matthias Mahler and the others faced in trying to edit it for the print. So you see the Taylor institution ownership mark at the beginning, also that it changed shelf throughout its life. You see the crossed out shelf marks. But it's not one of the first pamphlets. So the first batch of pamphlets was bought in the 19th century, while the glued-in auction catalogue entry at the very back shows that it was later bought. And the auction catalogue highlights that it's a very nice copy, but that it has some wormholes. And I think it's quite nice actually to have these copies that show the signs of use. Emma, if you just go to the end of the print section of the Passional, then we'll see the glued-in. Yeah, and you see behind it there's still several pages, because they were brought to the Taylorian not as reserved showpieces, but really as working copies for students. And so it's brilliant that now through Ed's edition, the promise of these empty pages bound in the early 20th century after the Passional is being realized. If you see also on this last page, there was a tab, which is at the bottom third of the page, which shows that it was originally part of a larger Sammelband of Reformation pamphlet, which was the only survival chance really for these copies that otherwise normally would be Zerlesen and read to pieces and not survive. But then in the 19th and 20th century, they were cut up in single study editions. Emma, if you could go to Choir D, please. So that would be 4 pages back about. Yeah. I like this page because there you see the challenge of which Ed already spoke, of the long German text which had to be edited down. So you see the caption on the left-hand side, Passional Christi und, in a kind of header letters, and then you see Antichristi in a much smaller font, because the text disparaging the indulgence sale of the Pope took up so much space that the printer couldn't fit in the large font used on the other pages. And that we'll see then in the Strasbourg copy later, that this is exactly what the early editions were particularly interested in, this point about the indulgence sale, because it's at that point that the additional pairs of illustrations are copied in. If you could just show the next double folio, please. Which is then the final folio or double spread of the copy, and it's the visually most striking opposition of the ascension of Christ versus the descent of the Pope. And again, the anti-papal polemic extended so far that the Antichristi had to be in a small size. So if you could go to one of the earlier pairs so that we see how it should be normally. There you see the Antichristi in the same a large font as the Passional Christi und on the top. I think that's enough of that. So I'll switch now back to our PowerPoint and hand over to Ulrich Bubenheimer, who is talking about early readers engaging with the Passional. Bitte sehr, Ulrich.
Thank you for the invitation. I will make some remarks on the reception of the Antithesis, figurata and the Passional Christi und Antichristi. An effective method for researching the reception of a 16th century edition is the so-called Exemplarforschung, that is, recording as many surviving copies as possible and evaluating their traces of use, marginalia, highlighting, drawings, and so on. So far, I have examined 8 copies of the Antithesis and 25 copies of the Passional, 9 of these printed in Wittenberg, 11 Erfurt, and 5 Strasbourg. Of these 33 copies in total, 17 contain old traces of use. Today, I can only go into a few of the insights I have gained: purchase price of the copies, and some aspects of the significance of coloring ins and annotations. First point, the purchase price. The purchase prices are recorded in 3 copies. Publications with woodcuts were usually more expensive than those without images. The original version of the Passional had 3½ sheets with 14 folios. An unillustrated pamphlet by Karlstadt with the same number of leaves, 14, printed in Wittenberg in 1521, was sold for 4 Pfennig, 1/3 of a groschen at 12 Pfennig. On the title page of a copy of the Passional printed in Wittenberg, a contemporary hand noted the purchase price, 1 groschen. Another customer in Austria paid 3 Kreuzer for the Antithesis, which is roughly equivalent to 1 groschen. But to a third buyer, a monk called Father Johannes Lechberger, the Wittenberg Passional was sent for 24 Pfennig, that is for 2 groschen. We see from these examples that there were not fixed retail prices, and postage and package might have played their role as well. But how much was 1 groschen worth in those days? That can only be estimated approximately due to the lack of conversion tables. Approximately 1 groschen per day was estimated for the foot of an artisan working for pay. His daily wage without foot was about 2 groschen. So, to buy the Passional, the wage worker had to work half a day to a whole day. My second point is coloring in and comments by the readers. Some buyers of the booklet had the woodcuts colored in professionally, as in 2 copies of the Antithesis. Others colored in the images partially with only 1 color or simply the ink. The coloring often contains interpretations of the images. At the suggestion of Bo Adams, my involvement with the Passional began with the Pitts Theology Library copy in Atlanta, an Erfurt edition. An anonymous reader colored in with brown wash or his grey ink only selected elements of the images, preferably headdresses and objects through which he could identify actors in the scenes depicted. Yeah, here we have the picture. This woodcut shows the Pope pursuing his pleasures at a jousting tournament with musicians and women instead of turning his attention to the sick and disabled as Christ is doing in the opposite image. The anonymous commentator gives the scene of the Pope a new meaning. He sees it as a fight against the papacy. The first annotation is diese stechen ums Papsttum. Papsttum wird vergehen. These are fighting for the papacy. The papacy shall pass away. Then the anonymous himself enters the scene and cheers on the fighters. Stecht, liebe Herren, stecht, und das Papsttum zerbrecht. Fight on, dear lords, fight and break the papacy. The notes of the anonymous show overall that in his reading he was primarily interested in attacking the Pope, which he exacerbated by his partly obscene vocabulary. The authors of the Antithesis or the Passional also evidently pursued the goal of shaking reverence and obedience towards the Pope out of their readers through the satirical portrayal of the Pope as the antagonist of Christ and through the antithesis of biblical and papal law. In the copies reviewed, most readers who left notes or doodled in their copy showed themselves to be primarily interested in the texts and images directed against the Pope. The change of the original title from Antithesis to Passional could perhaps suggest that the images of Christ could also be used in the traditional understanding of the word passionale for the meditation of Christ's suffering. However, a meditative use of the pamphlet was difficult, since viewers had the polemic against the Pope in front of their eyes next to each scene of Christ. Nevertheless, 2 copies have been found which prove that their users concentrated on the Christ scenes without showing any interest in the Pope scenes. The user of an Erfurt copy of the Passional only verbalized in brief words the theme of the respective depiction of Christ. For example, he wrote Corona spinosa, crown of thorns, or Christus baiulavit crucem, Christ carried the cross. Similarly, this can still be seen today in pattern images on so-called ways of the cross, images with very short texts. However, central stations of the Passion are missing in the Passional Christi and Antichristi, for example, the crucifixion of Christ. One owner of the Erfurt Passional also expected a depiction of the betrayal of Judas. And since he missed this scene, he identified one of the soldiers accompanying the carrying of the cross with Judas. He wrote, "Ei, ist das doch? Judas ist das." English, "Look, here we have Judas." In his simple approach, this reader wrote above Jesus' head in the scene where Christ is preaching to the people, Jesus ist das. Jesus is that. The notes of this reader, who also scribbled a writing exercise in his copy, show that the Passional could also find the interest of little educated lay people immersing themselves in the images of Jesus, while the images of the Pope and the texts on canon law remain foreign to them. The reader could have been a devout Protestant marked by a simply biblical piety that was no longer interested in polemical disputes. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank. Really exciting new insights into how these pamphlets were actually used. So now we turn to some of the actual pamphlets in the Bodleian library. And I would ask Andrew, could you show please first the other Erfurt copy that's in the Bodleian? So we'll first look at the copy in a bound volume that it's number 34 in one Sammelband, but it's a Sammelband of the 19th century, which rebound. So it's always a unbinding and binding of these copies. So they were sorted according to topic, and this is a full volume on anti-papal matters. And it's the 13th in this series of Lutheran collections. And then we'll look at the Latin copy, which is part of the Douce collection. Douce was a major donor to the Bodleian Library. Not a Germanist, so he mainly gave Latin copies. We have previously in this term looked at several copies of the Narrenschiff in its Latin version, the Stultifera Nabis. And then finally, we'll look at the extended version in the Strasbourg edition, which was bought as a single volume. So this is this 19th century Sammelband, Autographa Reformatorum. So could you just also show us the foredge, which shows how these different, each print outlet had its different format. So you can see how Strasbourg and Erfurt have all come together in their different pamphlet formatting. And all of them well thumbed. And actually worst for wear is the 19th century cover, which has been partly eaten by the leather worms. All of these pamphlets are just a couple of quires normally, and there we have the Passional with a 18th century entry on its provenance, which actually tries to claim it for Luther, a myth that is was debunked early on, and which Ed also discusses in his introduction. What's perhaps worthwhile noting now with the Passional is that it's, as Ulrich already mentioned, 3.5 sheets. And this might have been one of the reasons why the publishers were actually quite eager to extend it with 2 further pairs of oppositions, because that filled the 4th quire. So if you again want to go to the quire D, please, Andrew. we see the same phenomenon we've seen in the Taylorian copy, namely that to the end, the titles have to be downsized, the font, to fit all the anti-papal polemic on the page. And then it ends with D2. And then if you turn it over, the two verso simply has a very short summary. And the last rhyming couplet, nehmt alles für gut, es wird bald besser werden. So the hope for a better future without the Antichrist. All right, if you could please switch to the Antithesis. Which has actually the best woodcuts of all the copies we are seeing, because that's a Wittenberg produced from the original woodcuts. But we can also see that what Ed mentioned, that the Antithesis, despite being conceived earlier, was printed later than the German copies, because you can see some wear and tear at the edges of the woodcuts. So if we could look at something like B2, please. Here you see the title page, which has been mentioned. Or even here, I think you can already see, no, turn further, please. Yeah. We see some, here we see on the left-hand side a broken border at the top. And I'm very grateful to Richard Lawrence, printer at the Bodleian Library, who confirmed exactly how the printing process worked and how it would have worn out, especially the corners that might not be as well supported. If you leave slightly further. Yeah, here in the papal image, you can see how the top left-hand corner is worn away. Also on the left-hand side, on the Christ image, again, the top line is broken. So the images we have seen with the two Erfurt copies previously are in a better state, but they are actually copies from this. Very well done copies, so they don't show a change of direction, but just losing some of the details in the process. If we now could have a look, please, at the Strasbourg copy, which has all this additional material about which Edmund was speaking earlier. So you start with a title page, which is actually, as Ulrich Bubenheimer has written in his introductory essay, like putting the figures on a stage. It has a dialogue in the margin and at the bottom where Christ and Peter and the Pope are arguing among each other in rhyming couplets in German. And then these rhyming couplets continue throughout the volume on the above the woodcuts. So if you perhaps could turn again to the start of choir D, please. Yeah. There you see again running out of space because the choir signature D had to be put on the margin, didn't fit any longer underneath the printed text. And above the two woodcuts, you have the running title talking about Die Woche Christus Austrieb vom Tempel sein. So Christ drives out the moneylenders from the temple. And on the right-hand side, rhyming with that, mit Bullen, Bannbriefen zwingt sie der Papst wieder hinein. So somebody driving it out and hinein, driving it into the money. And I'm wondering, does any of you who have seen now the Erfurt copy of this page remember, if you had to spot the difference, what is different between the Erfurt copy and this copy? You might remember that Christ was actually driving out the moneylenders from left to right, as should be the case for any good person, because all good actions normally happen like on a stage from left to right, while the Pope should be the baddie sitting on the right-hand side, speaking to the left. But both of these woodcuts are mirrored, which is the sign of a cheap pirating operation, copying from an existing printed version of the book. So, and if we now turn over the page from D, going to D2, and you remember in the Erfurt copy and in the Antithesis, we had on D2 the ascension of Christ to heaven and the descent of the Pope to hell. But now we have an additional pair of illustrations, and you can clearly see where the interest is, because the left-hand side is just a recycled woodcut from an earlier pair, where it was speaking about poverty and richness, but the real venom has been reserved for the Pope again, and showing the Pope with a huge money bag, which gets its own inscription, Geld ein Sack voll Ablass. For money, a bag full of indulgences, shows the Pope. If you turn one further page, the next additional pair is even more drastic. The left-hand side is more or less nondescript, showing Christ pasturing the sheep, and you see one of the sheep on the bottom, a fairly healthy-looking big lamb. And on the right-hand side, you have the Pope with a crozier, which should represent the shepherd's crook, but in fact the head is not of a human being but of a wolf. So he has picking up a medieval trope of the wolf in sheep's clothes, and also the preaching wolf, who in fact is just out for the meat. And you see on the wall hanging the fleece of a sheep, and you see the tiny lamb at the bottom, shorn and much smaller than the healthy looking lamb on the left-hand side. And on the table in the middle of the woodcut, you see a figure with hands bound together at the back, being tortured just to cough up the money or to vomit coins. And something perhaps for discussion later, I was wondering whether this also picks up the iconography for Simon von Trient, who was quite an infamous case of anti-Judaic polemic of a boy who was reported to have been tortured by the Jews to get his blood. And the figure on the table actually has a pointed head, and the position is quite similar to that of the woodcuts of showing Simon von Trient. In any case, it's a very clear ramped up inter-papal polemics, if you can ramp up from the original Passional Christi und Antichristi. If you turn over one further page, please. So now we have a repetition of what was the original final copy. So the two additional pairs have been slotted into the sequence, so that to end with a descent of Pope into hell as the most dramatic visual image. And then you end with a final poem, which you can all read about in the printed edition that will soon be available in all good bookshops and on the website. Now that we've seen the extended version, we have a chance to return to one of the earlier versions in the copy of the Pitts Theology Library, and I hand over to Bo Adams, who will be talking about how Pitts has been engaging with their copy.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to see everyone. I'm struck by the opportunity of this text to bring everyone together when it was so clearly designed as a text to spread people apart. It is quite a reunion of old friends, seeing Edmund here and seeing Professor Bubenheimer with us. And so thank you for this opportunity. Pitts Theology Library holds the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection, which we claim is the largest North American collection of Reformation materials. We're in our 35th year of collecting, and have now amassed some 4,000 items from 1501 through 1570. And one of the great crown jewels of this collection is, of course, the Passional Christi, which we have long treasured and treasure even more that we've had the opportunity for Professor Bubenheimer to help us explain this wonderful work. What I'd like to do is quickly, I'll show some video of the actual pamphlet, and then I will switch to look at the digital edition that we are developing. The motivation behind our work was that the Passional is always a great teaching tool, and I think as we've all seen here, it lays bare quite clear the polemic of the 1520s and the way in which the visual media was used to make theological and political points. What we realized, as Edmund discussed earlier, though, is that still, even such a clear example of polemic needs explanation. And since the primary audience for our work is the general public through our exhibitions and instructional programs, we wanted to provide some of this clarification that you've heard today on the page itself, so that when people have access to the digital edition, they also have access to some of the subject matter expertise that we've heard today. And so our work has been to provide access to the digital, but also to provide access to some commentary around it, again, aimed at the general public. I'm going to try now to switch to my camera. And is this working? So here, I apologize, perfect. I don't have a tripod, so I'll try not to be as shaky. But here you see the Passional, as we have seen, and even on the title page is one of the 9 annotations that Ulrich has mentioned. Here, simply a note that this was indeed printed by Mahler in Erfurt. Throughout the work, you see that the images have themselves been lightly colored, as Ulrich has discussed. And you see a number of the marginalia added sporadically and largely on the papal side of the pamphlet. I'll pause here now and switch to the digital edition, which may be a little less shaky in my sharing. And can you see now my digital edition?
Yes.
Very good. So as you see here, we are in a beta release of what we are calling a Redux version of the Passional pamphlet. Redux is software developed here at Emory University, which allows us to overlay annotations directly onto the page and to do some interesting OCR such that the text itself is discoverable right on top of the image, which I'll show you in a second. The Passional itself combines the work of several scholars. We attempted to pull from a number of disciplines, including those who work on language and history, like Edmund we've seen, but also art historians like Larry Silver of Penn State University, Martin Lorman, historian of Reformation theology from Wartburg Seminary here in the United States, and then, of course, our friend Professor Bubenheimer, who has worked on the annotations. Each of them has provided a brief introduction to the Passional from their own particular disciplinary perspective that you can read online. But of course, the great fun is to explore the pamphlet itself. So here, for example, I'll pull up one of the pages that has a number of annotations on that, and we allow the user to choose which types of annotations the user would like to see. So in this case, I will simply choose the marginalia from Professor Bubenheimer. And he was too modest to share some of these more explosive polemical elements. But if you read here, and I won't read out loud, you can see just how heightened the polemic between the Lutheran side and the papal side has become. And I believe Professor Bubenheimer has dated these annotations to about the 1530s or 1540s. So largely kind of a next generation. And in many ways, particularly in his introductory essay, he has placed this polemic within the context of some of the later Lutheran polemic. And so you can see that some of this scatological language is indeed consistent with other things that we see in the 1540s. So I just wanted to provide a brief preview to the pamphlet that we are generating. It's available online, and I will share the link, but I will stress that we're in a beta release, and so we are continuing to refine the product. And this, in many ways, is a proof of concept for us as we plan to release future digital editions of our pamphlets, again, pointed toward a public audience, which is largely the audience that we're trying to reach with this work. So I'll stop sharing now. And again, thank you for the opportunity and look forward to conversation.
Thanks a lot. And we really hope to build on this in sharing further resources. So here you see the Taylor Editions site, which most of you will be familiar with. And that will be where we'll, for example, link in also the launch event from today. But we are also hoping to develop further via prisms the opportunity to have side-by-side different copies that all have IIIF capability, and also to be able to compare the different levels of annotations, of editions, different translations also. So watch this space for further developments. I'll share as last point the last slide from my presentation, and that is a warm invitation to next week's Digital Editions live, my kind of meta workshop, where we want to bring together the different insights that we've been developing throughout the term about the challenges of digital encoding, the advantages, and what we want to take over in a post-pandemic world. And to give a glimpse of the post-pandemic world, all those in Oxford are invited to in-person drinks after next week launch. So